Joining me now is Sherilyn Ifill, President Director Counsel of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, and former presidential candidate Lawrence Lessig, Harvard Law School professor and former clerk for Justice Antonin Scalia. And Larry, let me start with you. I know you clerked for Justice Scalia. There was a period of time when Justice Scalia had this position that he would sort of hire what he even called a token liberal among his clerks. What were your recollections of the man, your relationship? What was it like clerking for him?
He was an incredible man. I mean, the striking thing about him for me was he was an originalist who was a conservative. And the real test was when those two things conflicted, which they did probably 5 times when I clerked for him in the 1 year that I was there. And the test was, would he follow his originalism or would he follow what it was to be a conservative? And impressive to me was that every single time, not necessarily willingly or excited, he wasn't necessarily excited about it, but every single time he came around to what his originalism told him he had to do, even when that was a liberal result. And that was a mark of integrity in a place where you can get away with anything. You could reason yourself to any conclusion if that's what you wanted.
Yeah, he once joked about this he did have a sort of, his record, particularly on criminal defense, where the Bill of Rights particularly is quite explicit, was much more liberal than you would anticipate. He once made a joke about, I can't do all the terrible right-wing things I'd like to do to criminal defendants because the Constitution bars it. Sherilyn, let me ask you about this. So you got a 4-4 court. I think the natural question everyone says is, well, what happens if you get a 4-4 tie? Walk us through what happens when you get a 4-4 tie.
Well, if you get a 4-4 tie, then the decision below is essentially affirmed. I mean, the court has the ability to order re-argument in some cases if they choose to do so. But otherwise, the decision of the lower court, of the appellate court below, will stand.
So that means the winner, the person that won that case in the lower court.
Below.
So if, in the case of Texas, the law that has put tons of abortion clinics out and sort of challenges Roe in many ways, that law has been upheld. So if it were to go to the court and be deadlocked at 4-4, the law would...
That law goes forward. So, you know, in California, where you have the public union case and the question about, you know, whether people have to pay dues for public unions, in that case, the unions prevailed below. So if it's 4-4, they win.
The unions won in California. Everyone and their mother expected them to get creamed in the Supreme Court. Yeah. I mean, they expected a 5-4 decision against them at the very least. And you're saying...
Well, I mean, we'll have to see what happens. I mean, I think the most interesting, of course, remains the affirmative action case, because that's a case in which Justice Kagan had already recused herself. So it's the one case in which we're already...
7.
So it's 7. So now we're talking about a case, you know, that would have to be 4-3, and the question is whether, you know, in a case of this magnitude, whether the court would want to have the case decided with 7 justices or would ask for a re-argument. We really don't know, and we won't know. You know, usually we don't hear about some of these hot-button cases until the very end of the term, and so we're just not going to know for a while what the court decides to do.
So, Larry, do you have thoughts about who should replace the justice on the court that you clerk for? Are there names that you have seen circulating that seem attractive to you?
Well, I mean, there's an incredible diversity of really extraordinary people the president could pick could pick. But I would have thought, you know, I'm not sure that I know much about politics, but I would have thought that part of the calculation was which person would put the greatest pressure on the Republicans, which one would make it the most costly for the Republicans. And I think, you know, that would be a Hispanic appointee. So somebody like Tino Cuellar, who's a California Supreme Court justice right now, very young. I think he's 43 years old. He'd be the equivalent of a Clarence Thomas nomination in the sense that he's going to be there for, you know, generations. That would be politically a very difficult one for the Republicans to have to stand up against. But there's so many really incredible ones for him to pick among.
2 others I've heard: Sri Srinivasan, who's on the D.C. Circuit Court, was in the Bush administration, clerked for O'Connor, and won a 97-0 Senate confirmation 3 years ago.
But, you know, Larry points out the other pressure that's here. There's one pressure that's of the moment, you know, make it difficult for the Republicans. The other pressure is this is the 3rd appointment of this president, of the first African-American president. There are many African-Americans who are saying, you need to nominate an African-American nominee. There's also the pressure that Larry just talked about. It's several generations. It's 30 years. And so you can't just think about this Republican Congress. You actually have to think about the shape of the court for generations to come.
Well, and I should say on that note, Loretta Lynch, the Attorney General, someone who I've heard a lot about recently as well. We will see. Sharon Leifel, Lawrence Lessig, thank you both for your time. I really appreciate it. Today we saw something we've rarely seen since George W. Bush boarded that helicopter and left the White House back on January 20th, 2009. A public appearance by the former president, who showed up in South Carolina to campaign for his brother Jeb ahead of Saturday's GOP primary and take some apparent, not very thinly veiled shots at frontrunner and the tormentor of his brother, Donald Trump.
Strength is not empty rhetoric. It is not bluster. It is not theatrics. Real strength, strength of purpose, comes from integrity and character. And in my experience, the strongest person usually isn't the loudest one in the room.
Since George W. Bush left office, Republicans have not spent a lot of time reckoning with his administration's record on, say, fighting terrorism. The refrain has been simply that Bush, quote, kept us safe after 9/11. But on Saturday at the GOP debate, Trump took direct aim at that claim, and today he took his argument even further.
I've heard for years he kept the country safe after 9/11. What does that mean, after? What about during 9/11? I was there. I lost a lot of friends that were killed in that building. The worst attack ever in this country, it was during his presidency. You mean we had the worst attack ever? By the way, after that we did okay. That's meaning the team scored 19 runs in the first inning, but after that we played well. I don't think so.
For nearly 8 years, it has been an article of faith among Republicans that George W. Bush does not deserve any blame for the September 11 attacks, despite his having been in office 9 months and his administration having received repeated warnings, which have been documented, about al-Qaeda plots. It's an argument Marco Rubio made in response to Trump at Saturday's debate.
The World Trade Center came down because Bill Clinton didn't kill Osama bin Laden when he had the chance to kill him.
Trump is refusing to play along with the GOP's convenient reading of history.
There was tremendous information, and the CIA and various other agencies were not talking, and they were not getting along, and there were a lot of personality conflicts, and they all hated each other, and we ended up with the World Trade Center, okay? They had tremendous problems getting along together. That's management. Because if they did, they knew what was going, they knew some bad things were going to happen. They could have stopped it.
Trump even suggested that George W. Bush's decision to emerge and campaign for his brother after years of lying low is bad news for the ex-president's legacy.
If the ex-president is campaigning for his brother, I think he's probably open to great scrutiny. Maybe things that haven't been thought of in the past. I think it would be better for him if he stayed out.
All right, joining me now from out on the campaign trail, he's currently in Reno, is Dave Weigel, national political correspondent for the Washington Post, who wrote a piece about the Bush legacy. I have no idea anymore what to make of any of this in terms of trying to model the mind of the Republican voter. So this happened on Saturday. Everyone flipped out. Then today, Trump goes harder at it, and you've got everyone sort of, on the right and Republicans saying, he sounds like Michael Moore, he sounds like Michael Moore. But I honestly don't know. What is your view of how this plays?
Well, what happened immediately on Saturday was a kind of bandwagon effect, which was people in the room were booing Donald Trump for saying that. People in the room, as he was pointing out correctly, were the sort of people who can't see any fault in George W. Bush. Right. Not just Republicans, but Republican donors, former ambassadors, people who have a lot, I think, riding on the Bush administration, and sort of a retelling of history. And so one of the questions I always like to throw to Republican voters on the trail is just, should we have gone into Iraq? And very, very infrequently can they just say, yes, we should have. What had been happening over the last few years was an argument that, well, maybe we shouldn't have, but we were in a good place until Barack Obama came along. And that was what I saw as the risk of what Trump was doing, was stopping that rethink in its tracks.
There's a way in which the phenomenon of Trump has always been tied to Bush. And I think there's an argument to be made. I think David Frum's in this argument, a guy named Leon Donovan, who I follow on Twitter, is a very smart sort of Republican operative, that basically Trump emerged as the anti-Bush, that basically Trump's rise, this is Donovan, the phenomenon long ago metastasized into something else, but Trump's support started off as reflective, anti-Jeb, anti-establishment posture, that basically the Republican Party never dealt with the failures of the Bush administration or the anger conservatives had for him. And as soon as they were confronted with Jeb, they had this almost kind of like Freudian reaction that pushed them into the arms of Trump. What do you think of that?
Well, they did and they didn't. The branding of the Republican Party in 2009, 2010 was that this was no longer a George W. Bush party. This was a Tea Party that recognized and reckoned with the mistakes he'd made. And you saw a sort of beachhead of libertarianism in the Republican Party. You saw people who didn't really tie themselves to Bush. You saw one of my favorite pieces of journalism from last year, actually, is when Chris Moody from CNN asked questions of each Republican running for president at an event in South Carolina, in Greenville, where this debate was, and said, who is the best living president? And they couldn't say George W. Bush. But they were trying to have it both ways and saying, boy, we miss a time before Barack Obama. We miss when this country used to be more successful in winning wars, and they couldn't quite come around to defend him. Right. But it reminded me of what's happened a few times in our history, many times in our history, where we find ways to rationalize the mistakes that former presidents have made. I think it was going pretty well until this might be a watershed moment, might not, but certainly this argument is no longer universal because of what Donald Trump did.
Yeah, I should say that PPP has a poll. We don't have a graphic for it, but I'm just seeing here on Twitter. PPP has a poll out post-debate. Trump's up 5. He's got 30-plus points over Rubio and Cruz. I mean, if you're a Republican and you thought, a Republican professional political class establishment, you thought, I've got a read on where Republican voters are ideologically. Donald Trump just screams in your face, you're fired, every chance he gets. Dave Weigel, thank you very much.
This guy, Ted Cruz, is the most dishonest guy I think I've ever met in politics. You're willing to lie about anything, and then you hold up a Bible. It's no good. To me, it's no good. I hope you can tell all of your friends what dishonest people these politicians are, that they're liars. They're really liars, especially Ted Cruz. He's a absolute disgusting liar.
According to Donald Trump, Senator Ted Cruz is the single biggest vessel of misinformation in the race. Since the debate Saturday night, according to our informal count, Donald Trump has called Ted Cruz dishonest or a liar 52 times. He has accused the Cruz campaign of orchestrating robocalls in South Carolina that reportedly made negative and unfair statements about Rubio and Trump. Cruz said, quote, we had nothing to do with them. Trump has also accused Cruz of lying about his positions, and Cruz has claimed that if elected president, Trump would appoint, quote, liberal judges to the Supreme Court. Cruz was asked earlier today about things getting personal.
Two of the candidates in this race, Donald Trump and Marco Rubio, both have the very same pattern. Whenever anyone points out their record, they simply start screaming, liar, liar, liar. So I will continue to focus on substance and truth and let other candidates focus on the insults and attacks.
A few hours after Cruz made that statement, Donald Trump delivered one of the most direct character assassinations of a presidential candidate that I've ever seen.
I have never, ever met a person that lies more than Ted Cruz. And he goes around saying he's a Christian. I don't know. You're going to have to really study that. But he's a liar. Even Jeb won't go and say, like, you know, boom, Donald Trump is, like, against the Second Amendment. What Cruz says is incredible. He's a lying guy, a really lying guy. Some people misrepresent. This guy's just a plain-out liar. My opponents lie, especially Cruz. I mean, Cruz, as I said, he's the single worst liar I've ever seen. He is a very unstable person. That's just my opinion.
Just his opinion. Trump went on to say that if Ted Cruz didn't apologize and retract his, quote, lies, he would sue him, quote, relative to the fact that he was born in Canada, therefore cannot be president.
We will bring a lawsuit if he doesn't straighten his act out. But if Cruz ever got the nomination, the Democrats are going to file the lawsuit. So in a sense, I'm doing him a favor because I'm filing it early. If I file it, I'm filing it early.
Here's how Cruz, who was also campaigning in South Carolina, responded.
Today, Donald Trump held a press conference where he apparently lost. Have you noticed how rattled Donald gets when his numbers start going down? Yeah. He gets very, very upset.
Joining me now from South Carolina is MSNBC host and political correspondent Steve Kornacki. And Steve, I got to mention, I mentioned this poll. Do we have that graphic of showing what the PPP numbers are, the most recent polling that we have? The numbers don't appear to be going down. Just for the record, since the debate, Donald Trump at 35%, Marco Rubio, Ted Cruz tied at 18%, and Kasich, Jeb Bush, and Ben Carson. What do you make of this full-scale character assault on Ted Cruz by Donald Trump?
I mean, those numbers, and again, look, we'll see if there's, polls in the next couple of days that back that up, but those numbers suggest that this Trump strategy, it's working down here. And it's been working in general. I mean, he came to this state as the clear front runner The margin you're seeing on the screen, that's the margin we were seeing in the polling before Saturday's debate, before the South Carolina campaign really started to heat up. I'm thinking back 4 years ago. You remember the debates really moved things 4 years ago. Newt Gingrich had those back-to-back debates. He went after the media. He went after the questions about the open marriage. You started seeing movement in the polls down here right away. He basically gained 30 points in 5 days. So here we are a couple days out. If Trump isn't slipping at all after that performance on Saturday night, then I think he might be on more solid ground than we might instinctively think in launching this kind of attack against Ted Cruz.
Well, it's funny. You mentioned Newt Gingrich, and the thing I remember about Newt Gingrich is coming down to South Carolina. It was in South Carolina where he hit Mitt Romney from the left on Bain and private equity. He talked about, I think he talked about predator capitalism at some point. He was basically saying this is from the left, that this is a completely bankrupt model of financial capitalism to put people out of business. And he went on to win South Carolina. And to me, that was an indicator that there's some receptivity there for stuff that isn't just what you find on the Wall Street Journal editorial page, and Trump is testing that in real time.
I think that has been one of the big stories of the Trump campaign. I think we might be seeing that with, I know you talked about it before, but we might be seeing that with the attacks on the Iraq War and on George W. Bush. I mean, I think there's just been this knee-jerk assumption on the part of Republican politicians that Republican voters will not stomach any questioning of George W. Bush, any questioning of Iraq. And I think a lot of Republican voters, this is reflected in the polls, they only ever heard the attacks on George W. Bush and heard the attacks on Iraq coming from liberal voices, coming from Democratic voices. Now you have a voice that they trust within their party, within their tribe, saying this stuff. And I think they might just give up George W. Bush and go with Trump.
You know, Trump, again, relayed his sort of threat. You know, he had this big press conference, right, where he was making noise about an independent run, had a press conference, signed a pledge. I was there. The first question I asked that press conference was, why should anyone believe you'll hold to this pledge, which he basically didn't answer. Here he is today threatening that he might walk. Take a listen.
The RNC does a terrible job, And just remember what I said. Remember in this room. I signed a pledge, but it's a double-edged pledge. And as far as I'm concerned, they're in default of their pledge.
At this point, I think odds are above, more likely than not, that he is on the ballot in the fall one way or another, whether he wins his nomination, because I just can't see him going back to, like, developing golf courses after this if he doesn't win the primary.
Well, the other thing, too, is I don't think what you're showing there, the idea of dangling this prospect of a third-party campaign, ordinarily you'd say this is not a good tactic for somebody trying to win a Republican primary, somebody who's ahead. You don't start talking about that. It's only going to turn voters away. But I think what Trump is benefiting from here is how many Republican voters do not care right now about the basic proposition of the Republican Party itself winning. And I mean, traditionally, the role of South Carolina has been, it saved George Bush Sr., it saved George W. Bush, Bob Dole, the establishment candidate. Well, something changed in the last 5 years. That's how Newt Gingrich won this thing in 2012.
Yeah, and if Trump wins in South Carolina, the odds of stopping him in the Republican primary diminish considerably. Steve Kornacki, thank you for joining us.